A very good afternoon to all my listeners. This is part 2 of the state capacity evaluation of the Indian Police Force. I will start this video with a quick summary of what we saw in part 1, followed by an in-depth analysis of one aspect of the Indian Police Force and subsequent recommendations. So what we saw in the previous video was the role of the state. When we discussed the role of the state, what we saw was that irrespective of the nature of a polity, maintenance of public order is universally recognized as the prime function of the state. This is true not just from a Western text standpoint, but is also seen in Indic texts such as the Arthashastra. In the Arthashastra, the king was expected not only to ensure the safety and security, but also punish people with anarchic tendencies while maintaining individual and social order. So we clearly see that the prime function of the state is maintenance of public order, and this is achieved through the police force. We also then looked at crime. In the previous episode, we looked at crime by using the Beckerian model, which looks at crime from the standpoint of a rational individual. In the Beckerian model, a crime is said to be committed if the benefits from the crime exceed the costs associated with the crime. And we saw in the previous episode a simple example of the same. I will keep the slide alive for a couple of seconds for viewers who are seeing this for the first time to be able to digest the information present on the slide. As can be seen from the Beckerian model, the costs associated with a crime increase when the probability of arrest and conviction goes up. And this function of increasing the probability of arrest and conviction firmly lies with the police force and the criminal justice system, of which the police is an integral part. We then discuss the criminal justice system, which is essentially the process by which the state maintains public order, and as discussed, the police force is an integral component of the criminal justice system. When we view the criminal justice through the lens of prevention and deterrence, you can clearly see that the police force is responsible for increasing the perception of being caught, while also contributing to coherent investigations which can increase the probability of conviction when the case goes to the courts. Next, we decided to evaluate the Indian police force using a framework that was taken from a Western paper. As stated in the previous video, the police is one of the most difficult institutions to measure in any society because of the sensitive nature and inherent complexity of their work. They carry out a range of tasks, right from issuing parking tickets, passport verification, patrolling the streets, to core functions such as investigating crimes and preventing them. Despite the complexity associated with the measurement of the police force, what we did in the previous video was to break down the core functions of the police force into 7 pillars. One of these pillars is reducing crime and victimization. The second is to bring to book those individuals that have committed the crime. The third is to reduce fear while enhancing security, and inherently linked to this is ensuring civility in public spaces. To do the above four tasks, we expect the police to use their force and authority fairly, efficiently, and effectively, while doing so with financial resources in a manner that is effective and efficient. Finally, since the citizen is at the core of the state, we expect the police force to provide quality services that satisfies the citizen. So these are the 7 pillars that we use to evaluate the police force. There were clear quantitative criteria that you see on the screen, and basis the evaluation, what we finally observe is that sufficient data does not exist across vectors for us to be able to draw any clear conclusion. We see that over the last 2 to 3 decades, there has definitely been a reduction in crime rates. However, as mentioned in the previous video, the crime rates record reported crimes. However, there are 3x the number of unreported crimes versus reported crimes. What do I mean? If a total of 100 crimes are committed, only 25 crimes are actually recorded. The unrecorded crimes are not known to us, and for us to be able to assess the same, victimization surveys are required. However, we do not have a systemic recording of victimization scores that are carried out by any government body, and hence sufficient data does not exist on whether the true crime rate, which is both reported and unreported, going down or not. However, what we are certain of basis reported crime rates, and we looked at serious crime rates where the extent of unreporting is much lower, there is a clear reduction. Secondly, on increasing conviction rates, there has definitely been a decline, which does not paint the Indian police force in good light. Now, with regard to civility in public spaces, since the NCRB does not record where the crime has taken place, we do not possess any data. On the use of force, what we saw in the previous video was that there has definitely been an increase in custodial deaths with zero repercussions for the police officers involved, and hence that has shown a declining trend, which does not again paint the Indian police force in good light. On financial effectiveness or productivity, we again do not have any periodic available, and there are just 2 academic papers available on the same, which is not sufficient data for us to be able to draw a sweeping conclusion. And finally, on citizen satisfaction, there is no periodic data available, and hence for us to draw a trend line is not possible. We just have one report, or rather I've just seen one report where citizen satisfaction is documented. However, this again does not give us sufficient data across years to be able to state with conviction whether indeed citizen satisfaction is on the rise or decline. So in summary, there is not sufficient data available for us to draw a conclusion basis the framework defined. However, we definitely see that on certain elements, the police has done exceedingly well over the last 2 decades, starting with the reduction in serious crime rates. However, areas of concern are the falling conviction rates and rising custodial deaths. So then, how exactly do we identify opportunities? What we said we would do is we would rely on the experts, which in this case are commission reports that we've seen over the last 5 decades, followed by what the policemen themselves have to say. So, basis an in-depth evaluation of the commission reports, a few clear observations emerge. The first is a recommendation that stated that the police need greater operational freedom, and that this operational freedom needs to be done while also ensuring accountability. A second recommendation is that there needs to be an independent complaints authority set up to inquire into cases of police misconduct. This may be because the political executive and current oversight mechanisms favor existing enforcement authorities and are unable to form an independent and critical judgment. We also then saw that the Second Administrative Reforms Commission noted that the current working conditions of constables are poor and they definitely needed to be improved. There was also a recommendation on increasing the chances of a constable moving up the ranks, because in India, more often than not, a constable can at best expect one promotion in his lifetime. There are also concerns about housing that have been expressed by the Second Administrative Reforms Commission. We then have had these reports clearly calling out for the separation of law and order duties from investigation. It is to ensure that the investigating officers are not burdened with the daily law and order activities, and this could contribute to stronger cases being prepared, which can potentially address the falling conviction rates. We also have multiple reports from the CAG and BPRD, which is the Bureau for Police Research and Development, which states that the current police force has gaps on infrastructure, and this includes weaponry, vehicles, and the communication devices or networks that they are a part of. Now, when we ask policemen themselves on what is required to improve performance, you clearly see that multiple elements pop out, starting with the increase in the number of policemen and women, followed by increasing or installing CCTVs, street lighting, better network of informers, and so on and so forth. Now, as you've seen, a lot of the recommendations that have been made are made basis inputs that are received from either experts or policemen themselves. And since we've relied on an analytical framework to evaluate the police force, I took a step back to whether indeed a model can also be used to evaluate these inputs that we are hearing qualitatively. So the model that has been used in public policy is the results chain model, which models the entire value chain starting with inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and then their impact. What you saw in the analytical framework used earlier were the outcomes that were clearly mentioned, and hence the model that I'm going to be using will look at the inputs that the police force has so as to obtain the desired outputs and then outcomes. This is a simple example of the model being used to document what the inputs, outputs, and outcomes are for college, I would ask you to go through the same before using the same example for the police. Here it is an example where we use the inputs, outputs and outcomes framework on the police force. In this case, the input is more officers, the output is a higher police to population ratio, and the outcome is lower crime. So it is now incumbent on us to evaluate the inputs, because we know that the input results in outputs and the outputs result in outcomes, and it is the outcomes that we were measuring using the analytical framework, starting with crime rates and citizen satisfaction. So when using this framework, I obtained the following results. What I've done here is I have broken the inputs into hardware and software. Hardware essentially consists of physical infrastructure and manpower that house within the infrastructure, while software implies the platform on which the hardware lies. So as you can see, the inputs that we will be evaluating are police station, policemen, weapons, communication, vehicles, CCTV, forensic labs and cyber experts. And the inputs have been divided into hardware, software, and each of these elements have a quantity and quality element. What does that mean? Let us take policemen. So quantity implies that there need to be sufficient policemen. However, quality implies that these policemen need to be trained and they need to be capable. So each of our elements or inputs have a quantity and a quality measure as well. The outputs, as you can clearly see, are increased police station to population ratio, increased police to population ratio, increased police vehicle to population ratio, increased area under surveillance, increased forensic lab and increased cyber officers. And the outcomes ultimately are what we saw in the analytical framework, which is lower crime rates, reported and unreported, and increased citizen satisfaction scores. So net, the police force has to ensure that the outcomes improve over time, while the inputs required are clearly mentioned. And this framework, I believe, can be used to decide what elements need to change to inflect the outputs and eventually the outcomes. Now, let us evaluate these inputs, right? Let us first start with the police station and the policemen. When we start with the evaluation of hardware, which in this case is specifically manpower or policemen, what we see is that our sanction strength is 196 police personnel per 1 lakh population, while the actual strength as of 2023 is 155 per 1 lakh population, which means currently on one of the hardware inputs, which is policemen, we are at 79% of our sanction strength. Now, of the 155, only 103 are civil police officers. The remaining 52 policemen or women are armed police, which are typically not used for crime prevention or investigation. They are used for riot control and several other specific functions. So we already see that against our sanctioned input of 196, we are at 155, and when we double click 155, we see that only 103 are civil police officers. So the first question that I asked myself is You've got a vacancy which definitely the government needs to address. But far more importantly, where do we rank amongst other countries with similar GDPs or higher GDPs? And number two, is 196 the right input? Now, when you look at a cross-country analysis of the police population comparison, and this is again 2007 data, but I am near certain that the trends will continue to hold true, we see that most of the developed nations have a police population ratio which exceeds 200. Even for a country of comparable GDP per capita on purchasing power, Indonesia has a higher police population ratio. So definitely emerges that there is an opportunity. Now, what is the right number is what we're looking at. So then I did what every good researcher does. I Googled. Guess what? The answer is no. 196 police officers is not the ideal sanction strength. So then what is? Now, when you look for multiple articles, what you see is one number which constantly emerges, which is 222 policemen per lakh population. Now, this has been quoted multiple times in multiple reports, and this number 222 is quoted as the UN recommended police population ratio for India during peacetime. So I said, so is this the number that we are supposed to benchmark our input against? Well, the answer there also is no. Because this number 222 emerged, from what I understand, from a BPRD report which was written by Kamal Kumar IPS in 2013, and it has then been used in multiple articles and research papers subsequently. When a question was posed in Parliament about what is the ratio or whether our current police to population ratio is in line with the recommendations of the United Nations, as you clearly see, the Ministry of Home Affairs stated there are no universal standards or United Nations recommendations to assess the optimal level of police force in a country. So, in summary, our current sanction strength is 196. The question that I asked myself is 196 the ideal sanction strength? When doing so, the number 222 was off-quoted in reports and research papers, and this number was quoted as the UN recommended police population ratio for India. However, it clearly now emerges that 222 is not the ideal sanction strength, and this was obtained the answer obtained to a question in Parliament in 2021. So then, what is the ideal strength and how do we go about evaluating the same? As you can see, this ties in very well with what we had seen both in part 1 and earlier in the video, where policemen definitely stated that the biggest intervention basis surveys carried out amongst policemen was increasing the number of police. So everyone acknowledges that the current actual strength, which is 155, of which 103 are only civil police officers, is definitely not sufficient. The question that we are asking ourselves is, even if we were to fill the gap and increase our actual to 196, whether this is sufficient or not. Now, the answer to this question lies in two reports that the BPRD published. One of which was the report that I had cited earlier by Kamal Kumar IPS. It is the national requirement of manpower for 8-hour shifts in the police station. The second one is a report by the BPRD where they decided to answer this question of determining the norms for manpower for urban police stations in Chandigarh. We will get into both these reports and see whether the methodologies that the reports used can be reapplied across the country to help us answer this question. So let's start first with the Kamal Kumar BPRD report. Now, what this report does is quote several other studies that have done in the past, and this is an example for McKinsey study that was carried out for the Maharashtra police. Now, this McKinsey study is not available, unfortunately, but as stated by Kamal Kumar IPS, there were 6 factors that were considered by McKinsey. You had crime, law and order, citizen services, population, area, and several other factors like whether locations were of religious, tourism importance in the police station limits. They then divided police stations into 9 categories, but unfortunately, the recommendations of the reports on manpower norms were clearly not mentioned. But at least we get a glimpse into factors that were considered to be able to determine the manpower. We then get another glimpse of another study that was carried out by A.F. Ferguson in 2006 for Kerala police stations. Here we have a clear series of steps articulated, which essentially includes noting down all the activities in the police station, conducting a time motion study to evaluate how much time each of these activities take, and then incorporating the same with a shift system of 8 hours. Again, the output of this particular report has not been mentioned, but the methodology that this report employed is clearly listed down. So we had 2 reports, both of which give us factors and a methodology, but no clear answer on if this were conducted for Maharashtra and Kerala, what would the answer be versus what their sanction strength was at that time. Then what the study states at the outset is that there is little evidence of any systemic exercise having been taken up to arrive at appropriate yardsticks. This is very interesting because this report states that the sanction strength against which we measure sufficiency was not arrived at by using any systemic exercise. And the only 2 exceptions he quotes are the McKinsey study and the A.F. Ferguson study, which we just saw a few moments earlier. So it clearly emerges that the 196 number that we had, or when the study was conducted, which was in 2013, the number was close to 181. These numbers have no scientific methodology used to arrive at the same. Right? Now, is this the central government's responsibility? No. Because as we discussed in part 1, law and order is a state subject. So now let us look at what Kamal Kumar did to be able to arrive at what he believes is the ideal manpower. Remember, the same exercise that he is carrying out is to be able to determine what is the requirement of manpower specifically for 8-hour shifts. That is the problem statement that he's trying to solve. Now let's look at what were the recommendations of his study. Basis the detailed analysis that he carried out from surveys with police officers, he arrived at the conclusion that for 8-hour shifts, you will need 61% more manpower than the sanctioned police strength. So currently, if we were to reapply Kamal Kumar's study, the 196 number will have to be increased by 61% if the police force have to work in 8-hour shifts. Now this study was basis survey results obtained. And as you can see, what was done is very simple. He looked at the percentage of people working over 8 hours, or the number of hours over 8 that were put in by policemen. He then said, in order to get that down to under 8, what is the incremental manpower required? So it was an agglomeration of the survey results and him back calculating that these many additional people are required. There was no time motion study done, but this was an agglomeration of survey results at an SHO level, at a constabulary level, and then this was vetted as well. So 61% is the recommended police strength that he has estimated basis the problem statement that he was trying to solve for. It then goes on to state that certain tasks can be outsourced, and the set of tasks that can be outsourced are clearly listed on the screen. It starts with accounts to anti-encroachment duties to the summoning, the service of summons to the family counseling desks that are present at several police stations. This study, which I think offers a glimpse into what increased manpower can do, was then implemented in 5 police stations in Madhya Pradesh. So basis his recommendation and the results of the survey, they increased the strength of the actual police force in 5 stations. Right, you have Ashoka Garden in Bhopal, Padav in Gwalior, Chachhoda in Guna, Gorakhpur in Jabalpur, and Bedha Ghat in Jabalpur. When we again look at the pilot results using our inputs, outputs and outcomes framework, we'll see that the inputs definitely have gone up basis the Kamal Kumar recommendation. Now let's look at outputs. In the outputs, which is, look at the 2013 column, which is essentially the period in which the pilot was carried out, which is April 1st to 31st May. We see that on several of the outputs, such as the number of complaints that were acted upon, these have definitely gone up. And even in the execution of warrants, we see that the number or the output has clearly gone up with an increase in the manpower for these 5 stations. Now, when we look at outcomes, unfortunately, the study did not measure the pre-crime rate and the post-crime rate. However, it measured another outcome that we are interested in, which is essentially citizen satisfaction. And on citizen satisfaction, we clearly see that when this experiment was live, or when the pilot was live, this metric has significantly improved versus the previous period. So we have results of one of the 2 outcomes that are critical to be measured for the Indian police force, and here we clearly see that on one of the 2 outcomes there has been a significant improvement. However, on crime rates we have no data, and hence that I would say is one of the drawbacks of this particular study or pilot. Now, when we look at the shortcomings of the study, it relies only on survey data. It does not measure the time taken for activities that are carried out by the police force. It also does not take into account the recommendations that were cited to arrive at the manpower by previous studies, starting with the McKinsey study in 2007 and then the A. Ferguson study in 2006. It also does not consider key in the next decade. Again, the study was published in 2013. In the next decade, what technological inputs can be carried out to be able to reduce the amount of time taken. And finally, which I think is the drawback that I just mentioned earlier, is it does not measure one of the major outcomes of increasing the inputs, which is whether there was a reduction in the true crime rates, which is both reported and unreported. So these, I think, are the shortcomings of the current study, right? Some of which will be taken care of by what I'm about to show you. Now, when we look at the second study, which is the manpower norms for urban policing, what you clearly see is that this particular report tries to approach this problem in a scientific manner. Right? It's clearly called out at the outset, and they are trying to do so without any preconceived notions. What they first did is they listed all the tasks that are currently carried out by the police force. You will see that several of these tasks do not really require a policeman to be present, yet continue to be a part of the functions that a policeman or woman is expected to engage in. What they've done very well is actually talk of all the tasks and bucket it into three categories. You've got statutory duties, operational duties, and finally unaccounted for duties. I definitely think that a lot of the tasks can definitely be outsourced. I still do not know why a policeman is responsible for passport verification. Genuinely, is it needed that the police force actively engages in this, or can this be outsourced to an agency? Since in the passport office you've got TCS that manages the entire process, why does verification still have to be handled by the policeman, apart from it obviously being a source of unaccounted for income? So again, the study lays out all the activities that the policeman at a police station has to do. Then they carried out a detailed time motion study of all the activities that are carried out. It looked at, example, for a murder case, the amount of time that is collectively taken. They similarly looked at the collective time taken for a road accident case by the police, and basis the nature of the crime and past data, they were able to arrive at the total manpower required basis the caseload that they had. So this study has actually approached the problem in a scientific manner by using the total time required to solve cases and incorporated it with the past data available on the caseload. Basis this, they were able to then arrive at the total manpower required for the Chandigarh police to carry out all the activities that were mentioned in a scientific manner. What this report stated was that to be able to do all the tasks that were listed earlier, we will need a 25% increase in our sanction strength. The reason I mentioned sanctioned is not the actual strength, because there is already certain vacancies against the sanction strength. As seen earlier, against a sanction strength of 199 police per 1 lakh population, we currently have 155 policemen per 1 lakh population, which is a 21% vacancy against the sanction strength. What this study recommends is a 25% increase in the sanction strength itself. So A, it is incumbent for you to fill those vacancies that currently exist, but also increase the sanction strength to be able to carry out all the activities mentioned. So a great job done by this particular study to set out a scientific framework which can be reapplied across the country by states to arrive at what is the total manpower that they require to carry out all the activities mentioned. However, this study also has certain shortcomings. It does not take into account one of the key aspects of the Kamal Kumar study, which is the number of working hours. Because in this study, there is an inherent assumption of a 12-hour working day for the police, which is not useful when you want a professional fighting force. Secondly, it also does not offer a framework in which of those activities that are mentioned can be outsourced. Because in doing so, you would obtain at a far sharper list of activities which might again reduce the total sanction strength required. And finally, it did not carry out a pilot to demonstrate what is the tangible impact on outputs or outcomes which we saw in the Kamal Kumar study. So now what? Well, the recommendation that can be made is going to be a combination of these two studies put together. Right? What do I mean by that? When you look at the strength of the police force against our current sanction strength of 196, we will have a recommended sanction strength from anywhere between 243, which is a 25% increase that we saw as per the Chandigarh study, to 327, which was recommended by Kamal Kumar. So this is the range that we can expect the sanctioned manpower strength to move up to if we incorporate the dual objectives of 8-hour working shifts and sufficiency of manpower to carry out detailed activities. So what is my recommendation? Well, first, it is critical to determine what the core functions of the police force are. Followed by this, you need to outsource known core functions of the police force to other government bodies or private institutions. And this recommendation has not been made by me. This has also been made by the Second Administrative Reforms Commission in 2007. The second step, once you determine the core functions, carry out a time motion study, as was done by the Chandigarh police report, wherein you determine for each crime and for each activity the time taken. Do this across states, do this in multiple police stations, incorporating rural, urban, and including terrain and different places of religious importance or high tourist footfall. Then you assume a certain productivity, working hours and working days to determine the manpower. And the formula is very simple. Again, it will have to be done by incorporating the scientific method that was showcased in the Chandigarh report. And you take the total time required and you divide it by the productivity percentage, working days and working hours. Basis this, you will obtain a new sanction strength, right? And basis what we saw in the previous slide, it could be anywhere between 25% to 61% as was recommended. Once you calculate the new sanction strength, basis your budgetary constraints, you will need to formulate a plan to bridge this gap over the next 5 years. So against a 196, you may decide over the next 5 years, I need to get to some number between 243 to 327. Once you decide that, over the next 5 years, make progress at meeting this particular gap that exists on your inputs. Because as can be seen from the Kamal Kumar report, an increase in manpower definitely affects the outcomes and finally results in a far safer environment, which is one of the prime functions of the state. And this exercise needs to be repeated by an appropriate body. It could be the BPRD every 5 years. So that's it for me, folks, for part 2. In part 3, we'll get into the other elements that I've mentioned as an input. We looked at manpower today and we used 2 reports to be able to arrive at what the potential right input is. In part 3, we will look at using similar frameworks and reports, can we arrive at what the right strength or sufficiency is on other inputs to be able to inflect our outcomes, which is essentially crime rates and citizen satisfaction. Thank you.